All right. Well, welcome everyone. Silverado Policy Accelerator is thrilled to have you with us here this morning for the event on Ante Up, going all in on the global chips race. We have a great group here today on Zoom and watching live, from media to academia to industry and government. And of course, our all-star panel. I'd like first to introduce Congressman Raul Khanna, who's running just a few minutes late and will join us shortly, but he's representative for the California's 17th Congressional District. Congressman Khanna is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, the House Agriculture Committee, and the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Representative Khanna also served in President Barack Obama's administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce. It is a pleasure to have him with us today. We're also joined by Congressman Mike Gallagher, representative for Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. Representative Gallagher serves on the Armed Services Committee, where he recently served as the chair of its Defense Critical Supply Chain Task Force. Congressman Gallagher also sits on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. Thank you for your service and for being with us today, Congressman. I'd like to also welcome Mark Montgomery. Mark is the Senior Advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He previously served as the Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John McCain. Mark served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. Thank you for your service, Mark. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank my colleague, Sarah Stewart, Silverado's Executive Director, for being part of today's discussion. Before joining Silverado, Sarah led Amazon's public policy efforts on U.S. trade policy and export control matters, and served as a Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative for Environment and Natural Resources. At any time throughout the event, we welcome the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we'll reserve some time at the end to turn to those. We're also live streaming and recording this event, which we will make available on our website. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a bit about our Silverado Policy Accelerator. As the world competes for the newest technologies, the smartest economies, and the broadest sphere of influence, the nations that assert bold, long-term strategies will shape the global order for decades to come. At this pivotal moment of geopolitical competition, the United States must chart a course toward economic prosperity at home and competitiveness on the world stage. My co-founder, Maureen Hinman, and I started Silverado to help forge this path by working to identify the best solutions to critical policy challenges, and then incubating and accelerating those ideas into concrete results. Today's event on the global race for semiconductors falls squarely in our ambit, and we'll look forward to the discussion. So let's jump in. Semiconductors are the bedrock of the global economy and key to both consumer and defense applications, from kitchen appliances to electric vehicles to missile systems. Without a steady and reliable supply of chips, life as we know it would not be possible. No new phones, cars, or even supply parts to keep our planes flying, not to mention how it would impact national security missions. In fact, we would not be having this discussion on Zoom today without chips powering the cloud systems that Zoom has to enable this key application. The recent chip shortage has highlighted the widespread impact of interruptions in the semiconductor supply chain, from automakers who had to idle plants and furlough workers to patients who depend on chip-powered equipment like ventilators. How the US and other countries respond to the shortage is critical, but it also foregrounds the enormity of the economic and national security implications of failing to simultaneously develop and implement a longer-term semiconductor competitiveness and supply chain resiliency strategy. The National Counterintelligence and Security Center announced in October that semiconductors are among the few technologies where production is so critical that it may determine whether the US remains the world's leading superpower or is eclipsed by strategic competitors in the next few years. Against the backdrop of a global race for technological competitiveness and innovation along the entire semiconductor supply chain, the United States needs to take bold steps to demonstrate leadership in strategic thinking in 3 key areas. 1, domestic investment and incentives to expand manufacturing and R&D diversification of the supply chain in coordination with allies. And 2, countering China's moves to surpass the US in the race for global chip supremacy. With that frame, let's dive in. So, Congressman Gallagher, let's first go to you. There's been a great deal of bipartisan support, particularly in the last few months, for the initiatives that would strengthen the U.S. competitiveness on trade and technology and to counter threats from the Chinese government. You have been a key leader in this area, including your focus on the Endless Frontier Act and key pieces of legislation that are now pending, including the USICA Act, the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, which includes the Endless Frontier Act, as well as the CHIPS Act, which funds the up to $52 billion creation of new fabs in the United States. Where are these bills currently sitting in your view? And are they being packaged as part of a broader legislation? And can you elaborate on the importance of moving them forward?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dmitri, for having me. And thanks for everything you're doing at Silverado. This is a very unique and I think essential organization that you've built, and convening conversations like this is absolutely critical because we're at a very critical time vis-a-vis our competition with China. As for where these bills sit, I was hoping Khanna could answer that question. He might have some better insight than I do, because I think there are many, myself included, that are of the mind that, just given the nature of the congressional calendar, given how closely divided it is, probably the wisest course of action would be taking what the Senate was able to pass and passing that through the House, perhaps, with a debate about inserting some guardrails in there or shoring up a few issues. But right now it seems to be caught in between committee jurisdiction as well as in the Speaker's office in the House. And if I'm wrong about that, Khanna can tell you. So that's very concerning to me. This is a rare piece of bipartisan legislation. We have a huge opportunity to move forward. I mean, anytime you have a unique ideological mix from Senator Schumer and Khanna to myself and Todd Young and everyone else that supported it. I mean, you have Mike McCall on the Foreign Affairs Committee has been a champion for all of these bills. I just think that's a rare thing. We have to seize that opportunity right now in Congress. So I'm hoping we overcome any jurisdictional issues that are there. I'm hoping we move out very quickly and seize this moment. But that is really a decision for the Speaker to make right now. And the final thing I say is, in light of everything you just said about the role semiconductors play in our daily lives, I view ensuring access to semiconductors really as a matter of national sovereignty at this point, because without them, any country could functionally be held hostage. And certainly the Chinese understand this right now. And if we don't move forward with legislation like this, I fear that we're going to be in a very precarious position, particularly as it pertains to a potential conflict over Taiwan, which we can get into later.
Perfect. And we certainly will. And Raul Khanna will join us in a few minutes. So we will ask him that question about where the bill stands. But Mark, let me go to you. There's now widespread recognition that we have a manufacturing shortfall in the US and we need to expand domestic production. We have seen some big announcements from the private sector, from Micron, from Intel, Samsung, and others about investments that they're making in the United States and in various states to put fabs there. But at the same time, though, our allies and our adversaries are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into supporting their own semiconductor industries. I would argue that given the centrality of this US supply of chips to our economic and national security interests, this is a sector that deserves federal investment and incentives to ensure long-term sustainability. So do you agree with that? And if so, how would you respond to criticisms that the federal government should not be intervening and should not be doing industrial policy?
Well, Dmitri, hey, first, thanks for having us here, and thanks for bringing up this topic. I think it's very timely with what I hope the congressional calendar is. And to get your specific question, I think the criticisms you were talking about are pretty shallow, and often you hear these phrases like it's un-American to intervene in a market like this. I point out to these critics to both the facts and the history of our nation. The U.S. has done lots of our own brand of industrial policy in the past, whether you're talking, especially when it implicates national security. You can think of the Tennessee Valley Authority. You can think about how we fought and won World War II with the big, automotive companies in Michigan, the Radio Corporation of America in World War I, and more recently, Semitech in the 1990s. And we've used light touch interventions to create more compelling business environments and enable growth in certain sectors. people often forget the important role the federal government played in incubating Silicon Valley, in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In any case, in the context we're talking about here, that ship has sailed. We're already intervening. The important thing now is to make sure we do so with a actual coherent plan that aligns with our values. And when you step back and look at ICT, we really have a problem with China right now. Over the past 2 decades, they've mobilized state-owned and state-influenced companies to grab a dominant position in some markets for these technologies, and it's not an accident. They've had a concerted strategic effort. It's a mix of legal and unfair practices. They have good investment R&D numbers. They have government-led industrial policy, but they build influence on the back of their diplomatic and trade negotiations. But they also use unfair and deceptive trade practices. I think they have conducted state-led intellectual property theft and manipulated international standards. So I think, as a critical strategic competition between China and the U.S., really between China and the U.S. and its allies and partners, is taking place in an international system of commerce that, due to this Chinese state intervention, isn't free or fair. So it's time for us to have this strong industrial policy, and I'm excited to have legislation that pushes it and to discuss it here today.
Well, speaking of that legislation, thank you for joining us, Congressman Khanna. We're very glad to have you. We were just talking about you a few minutes ago, as you're the key leader in the House on some of these critical bills like USICA and Endless Frontier and CHIPS. So we had a question earlier for Congressman Gallagher, who punted to you a little bit on where do we stand currently with these bills? Why is it so important to move them forward? If you don't mind, could you please address that?
Thank you, Dmitri. Thank you for inviting me. And I've really appreciated working with Congressman Gallagher for a few years on these bills. As he knows, the bills are critical. I mean, just today, Intel CEO said that one of the biggest things we need to do is have the funding for semiconductor manufacturing, which is part of the U.S. Innovation Competition Act. It has passed the Senate. Candidly, it should have passed the House a while back. We've been pushing on it. It's been too slow to pass the House. We finally have a commitment to get it out of the House in January, and then it will go to conference. So I'm confident it will eventually pass, but it should have happened months ago. And I heard Mark Montgomery. I mean, he's absolutely right about the role that DARPA played, particularly in Silicon Valley. I mean, Vince Cerf at DARPA basically helped create the internet protocols, the TCP IP protocols that connected the internet. And then you had the National Science Foundation that invested to connect the research universities. That was the genesis of the internet. No politicians. It was really DARPA, and that was the foundation for a lot of what happened in the Valley. And then DARPA and other agencies helped with the mobile platforms and really facilitated mobile technology. So we have a healthy relationship in our country between the private sector, between government agencies, defense, and academia. I would argue China does not. I mean, for anyone who thinks that China is going to outstrip the U.S. in competition on innovation, I have one question. Where is Jack Ma? I mean, if you're an aspiring entrepreneur, billionaire, I don't know why you'd want to go to China. They view you as a threat. They view you as a subversive to democratizing power. And that's just not a long-term sustainable vision for society. So I think we have to do everything to prepare ourselves. But I don't buy this hype that China is somehow more innovative than the United States.
Well, it's great to hear. So, Sarah, let me go to you. So, as we just heard from Congressman Khanna, there's hope that the U.S. Innovation Competitiveness Bill, which includes the CHIPS Act, will move in January. What are the considerations we need to be thinking about in terms of implementing it responsibly and strategically? It's a lot of money, $52 billion that the government will be doling out. Do we have the manpower, the expertise, forecasting of data, and the guardrails to ensure that this funding achieves its objectives?
Well, thanks, Dmitri. And I think anytime that the US is considering incentives or tax credits for a particular industry or sector, we need to have a dedicated strategy in place to ensure that the taxpayer dollars maximize US interest and go as far as they possibly can. I mean, I think we've already talked here today about some successful attempts. There's also been failed attempts at, at investing in a particular sector. So I wanted to raise a few things on the less sexy side of this discussion, but I think that are critical to ensuring really successful implementation, hopefully after the funding is passed. So first on manpower and expertise, I mean, when we think about the enormous task of programming out over $50 billion over the coming years, it's really important that the agencies responsible have the human and technical resources that they need to do it. We have incredibly talented and experienced staff working across the government, but this would layer on to already intense workloads. I mean, think about it. Programming out the funding is going to include prioritization of projects, which recipients should receive the funding, intense interagency discussions, meetings with industry, evaluation of applications, monitoring of the progress of the funding. So we really need to make sure that there's dedicated staff to do that. A second piece is on data sets. And I think as Commerce, who's likely the agency that would be programming this out, determines which projects make the most sense and are in the best interest of the United States, they have to have the most up-to-date, comprehensive information on domestic and global trade flows, production and capacity, supply and demand, global planned capacity investments, geopolitical risk, and how that's going to impact supply chains. And that's just a few. And then, of course, we have multiple different segments in the chip industry: logic, analog, and memory. And within those, many, many different nodes that support a wide range of applications. So ensuring that the government, and frankly, that the public has access to the data that's needed to really match up where we're going in the next 5 to 10 years with these investments, I think is going to be really important. There's lots of different ways to do that. One way is to have the U.S. International Trade Commission do a study, but there's other ways as well. And last, just to hit on this briefly, the 2021 NDAA that authorized the CHIPS Act had some guardrails in it for funding. And these are among the things that you would expect. No money can go directly to foreign adversaries. Makes a lot of sense. But there's a range of other permutations of arrangements that could take place. And so I think as we think about implementation, we want to make sure that Commerce is able to talk frankly with recipients about their planned or ongoing engagements with certain countries and make sure that we're really protecting our investment so that it's not just going out the back door.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So Congressman Khanna and Congressman Gallagher, let me go back to the two of you. So domestic investment is only, of course, one side of this coin. While we need to focus on manufacturing domestically, it is technically infeasible and frankly, economically foolhardy to bring the whole supply chain back to the United States. And the US already started to coordinate with allies such as South Korea and Japan and the Quad on some of these issues, specifically the semiconductor issues. So Congressman Khanna, what more can the US do to work with like-minded countries, strategic allies, to diversify the regionally concentrated parts of the semiconductor supply chain and seek new market opportunities for US-made semiconductors and equipment?
Dmitri, I think ally shoring is a critical part of our strategy. I mean, we want our critical supply chains to be in the US, the part that is most critical. But then to the extent that we need a global supply chain, because in a modern economy, you can't literally have every single thing in the United States. We ought to be working with allies, with South Korea, with Japan, with India, with other allies that we can count on. I do think with semiconductors, though, it's particularly important that we get the mass manufacturing capacity in the United States. Right now, it's all largely in Taiwan. I mean, if something unfortunate were to happen with Taiwan semiconductor company, you literally would have the American economy come to a standstill. Everything from our iPhones to most of the consumer products, electronic products, are reliant on chips that they're mass manufacturing. So having them in Arizona and expanding that capacity in the United States, having Intel or others emerge for mass manufacturing is critical. And then for the broader supply chain, I would look to having a clear sense with our allies of how we can not be dependent on China.
And I assume both of you would not mind if there's more production in California and Wisconsin as well, in addition to Arizona.
Specifically Wisconsin.
Congressman Gallagher, so we're hearing a lot about the economic discussions of supply chain diversity, as Congressman Khanna just mentioned. But given the national security implications of really getting this right, certainly, most of our military systems, weapon systems are dependent on these chips. Shouldn't the U.S. also be looking to ensure that semiconductors are part of strategic conversations with allies in a variety of fora that we have, NATO, Munich Security Conference, and the like? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, 100%. I think it's worth dwelling a little bit upon the geographic concentration that you brought up. On the current trajectory, if you add up Taiwan, South Korea, and the PRC, that's going to account for something like 90% of all high volume leading edge semiconductor production. So that's not just Taiwan's problem. South Korea may not be in the CCP's crosshairs the way that Taiwan is, but it is in the crosshairs of another aggressive communist neighbor. And making matters worse, if there's a conflict over Taiwan, Las Vegas rules do not apply. What happens in the Taiwan Straits will not stay there. It would inevitably impact sea lanes and trade throughout the region and disrupt the flow of semiconductors from Korea in particular. So I think prudence demands we can't afford this level of geographic concentration in the backyard of our primary adversary. And the only answer is to invest in a dispersed semiconductor production, as well as to elevate this issue in the variety of international fora that you talk about. And I think at a minimum, work more closely with our allies to at least map out the supply chain and understand where all the single points of failure are. For example, understand how dependent we are on single points of failure at Dutch lithography companies. I just think we don't yet have that shared understanding of how fragile and vulnerable the supply chain is. So at the same time, we invest in a robust domestic production capability. I agree wholeheartedly with Raul that I think there's much more we can do to work more closely with our allies, and not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but all over the world. I'm intrigued by ideas. I guess the final thing I'd say is, at the same time, we try and avoid that worst case scenario, a conflict or a war over Taiwan. We do need to plan for the worst. And while it's not pleasant to think about, I do think we need to plan at least for how we are not going to leave Taiwan and all of its semiconductor capability in the hands of the CCP should they launch a fait accompli invasion. We should also consider creating special visa pathways for critical TSMC personnel ahead of time in the worst case scenario. In the case of a looming invasion, at least we can get them to safety and bring their expertise to the free world. And I don't bring that up to suggest we're going to give up on the defense of Taiwan, but we just need a backup plan to ensure that by taking over Taiwan, the PRC can't hold the rest of the world hostage.
That's a great point. And I want to point out that even though TSMC has committed to building fabs here in the United States, which is very important, a lot of the expertise for running those fabs and troubleshooting them and making sure that the yield is acceptable is still in Taiwan. So having more of those people have a pathway to come here where they're not at risk of a CCP takeover of Taiwan is really critical for not just operation of the fabs in Taiwan, but even the fabs that they have here in the United States. Let me ask you, Mark, about one other point that is often not raised in this discussion on chips, because you have the IP issues that come with the technology, you have the equipment capabilities like the advanced lithography from ASML, the Dutch company that Congressman Gallagher just mentioned. But you also have a critical materials piece to this, the rare earths that are critical for the manufacturing of this technology. A lot of them, of course, today come from China. What are your thoughts on how well understood this issue is, and can it be really can the chips shortage and the security of that supply chain be siloed from the rare earths problem that we face?
Thanks, Dmitri. It's a good question. I want to first comment that understanding is definitely improving among our policymakers, and not just the leading congressional thinkers with us today. But I'm not 100% sure all the U.S. government is wrapping its head around everything, and so there's work to be done there. I look at this as kind of a delicate entanglement, this materials issue. We hold a lot of that key intellectual property, and we and our partners, and you mentioned the Dutch AMSL, but we produce most of the equipment critical to fabricating certain types of semiconductors, but we also do most of the fabless work in this manufacturing technology. But for sure, China has a large influence on the raw materials and parts of the manufacturing itself, and a large number of TSMC fabs, or Taiwanese owned fabs in China. And I think the third group of this is Taiwan and a handful of other third parties that are critical. And when you look at this, you have to ask yourself, is this status quo a sustainable situation? And I think there's reasons to think it isn't, and that it presents some potentially intolerable risk. And in raw materials, I think there's a really good example here. The U.S., I think China now outproduces the U.S. by about tenfold in silicon. And while we still barely meet our own demand, I guess we're actually slightly below our own demand. We manufacture less than, or mine less than our demand. It's going to get significantly, that delta is going to start to grow. And I think as we try to look at this, we see the same problem also in like germanium and other rare earth elements, where the U.S. just is not even in the game. And it's impractical for us, even if we could mine them, it's impractical right now for us to process and refine them in the U.S. So we definitely have critical dependencies. And so what we have to decide is, are those dependencies going to be on nations who are allies and partners, or China? And I agree with Representative Khanna and Gallagher that kind of ally offshoring and that reliance on key allies and partners like Estonia, South Korea, Malaysia, and Japan, we need to really spread this this effort out. They all produce rare earth elements, all the countries I mentioned. We need to be working with these to ensure we have a reliable supply. But we also ought to cultivate other opportunities for mining and processing among allies and partners, especially those closest to our borders. And that would reduce some of the concern that Representative Gallagher talked about, the Las Vegas rules applying and knocking out the 60% of trade that flows through the Western Pacific.
And I would add that we did an event at Silverado recently with Australia on these key issues. And of course, they have a significant capability in mining and rare earths. So we should be working with them and other members of the Quad on these issues. Sarah, one more question on the allies piece, and then we'll turn to the very important topic of China and how they play into this. But with regards to the allies, do you believe that we need a supply chain summit for chips to coordinate new investments and to make sure that we're avoiding redundancies? Because you now have a lot of countries, the EU, Japan, South Korea, that have announced their own investments in semiconductors, which is fantastic in order to diversify supply chain. But we want to make sure that we're all not building the same thing, given the widespread of needs that we have across different nodes and analog, digital, memory, and logic, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I commend the efforts that Commerce and USTR and others have already made to elevate this issue in a range of fora. I'm reading about it every day and feeling really encouraged. And it's not just coordinating on supply chain diversification. It's also, we need to be coordinating with our allies and our strategic partners on nefarious, unfair, and often illegal practices like IP theft, forced technology transfer, and others matters, because this is a long-term issue that we have before us. We've spent a lot of time looking at the chip shortage, and that is a critical challenge that needs to be solved. But this will last, 5, 10 years, 20 years, the challenges that we're talking about here today. We're only going to see the demand for chips increase. And that's going to require more investment, more attention on innovation, on R&D, on energy efficiency, on access to critical materials. And going it alone is not going to be the key to success. So we've got to be working with our allies. I think Congressman Gallagher raised, doing a mapping exercise. I think that's a threshold issue. If we have a patchwork of bilateral initiatives and work streams, that is a great start, but I think we need an overarching coordinating body that's going to knit those efforts together and to really look across all of the different aspects of the supply chain and to think through how we move into the future. So, the G20 kicked off a supply chain summit more broadly, talking about, how it might implement further discussions in 2022 on a, more product specific basis. I think there really is an opportunity here on semiconductors in particular, and obviously not just limited to the G20 group.
Great. So let's turn our attention to a certain very large country in Asia who is looming very large in all of these discussions. Congressman Khanna, you mentioned TSMC, who is, of course, the largest semiconductor manufacturing company in Taiwan, and such a critical part of the global supply chain of semiconductors. And should something happen to them through natural disaster or cyber attack, it would be devastating to the world's economy. But of course, you're also seeing China make very aggressive moves from a military perspective around the Taiwanese airspace and waters, and there are growing threats of invasion that many members of the administration are talking about, including just yesterday, CIA Director Bill Burns being very worried about possibility of invasion in the coming decade. And the Chinese government has articulated its ambition to indigenize its chips industry and achieve independence on the West for semiconductors, which undoubtedly would give them a lot more leeway to advance its objectives of reunifying with Taiwan if they don't have the dependency on Taiwan or the rest of the world on chips. So I would argue that it's not enough just to focus on outcompeting China, but also focusing on how we can work with our allies to make sure that we can slow down China's race to independence and use new and existing tools like export controls and foreign investment reviews. Do you agree with that? Do you think that we need to be looking seriously at this issue? And do we have the tools necessary to achieve this objective?
I do agree with that. We have export controls currently on a place where we lead, which is the actual tools that are necessary to make semiconductor chips. But there's another area which I've been looking at in Silicon Valley. My understanding, and I don't know all of the details, but my understanding is that the United States still leads in the actual software that is necessary to design the chip. And that is something, frankly, Taiwan is dependent on us. There are about 3 or 4 companies in this space. My understanding is we don't currently have the sufficient export controls on that software going to China. And one of the things that, in fact, I was going to talk to Mike about it once I got more information, and I think the United States ought to do is make sure any of the tools that we have that are indispensable to the chip design process, that we're not allowing for that to be exported to China. Now, that's not going to stop China, but it can slow them down by 2, 3, 4 years. And we ought to look at that very seriously.
That's great. I do want to point out that there's a lot of holes currently in our existing even equipment export control strategy, because our current policy on some of these issues is that we will not export 10 nanometer, for example, equipment technology to China, but you can actually export more higher nanometer technology or less. So we need to make sure that we're shoring this up and not allowing the Chinese to walk through our export controls.
I completely agree with that. I'd strongly support stronger export controls. It's foolish to be giving away our advantages to China.
Great. Congressman Gallagher, let me turn to you. You sort of mentioned this point before, but how do you think this race, both on the Chinese side for chips independence, but also our strategic interest in keeping China dependent on the West for semiconductors, plays a role, if you think it does, in potentially deterring an invasion of Taiwan, which would be obviously devastating, not just for the Taiwanese, but for the world in general?
Well, first, can I just foot stomp or add my agreement to what Ro just said about, I think we need better guardrails in place. I've just put it more colloquially. And in my simple view of the world, if you take federal funding, you shouldn't be allowed to sell the product of that funding to Chinese entities, either directly or through a third party like TSMC. The last thing we need is taxpayer supported innovation finding its way into the hands of the CCP. I would go farther and say there can be no double dipping. You can't ask for CHIPS funding one day and then announce your plans to build new fabs in China the next. And then I think we need to create a system of outbound capital controls to avoid subsidizing the Chinese tech sector in general and semiconductors in particular. As to your question about, which is really a question about deterrence, right? I mean, okay, so if you have more than half of the world's annual 300 millimeter foundry capacity in Taiwan, that's a single point of failure for advanced US technology. And since China itself accounts for just under 30% of 300 millimeter foundry capacity, if it were to conquer Taiwan, it would control nearly 80% of global semiconductor production. So that gives it extraordinary coercive power to withhold critical components to any company, nation, or military that criticizes, for example, its ongoing genocide or its predatory economic practices or its complete destruction of the environment. So I view that as not only dangerous, I view it as an invitation to aggression. It's an imperfect analogy, but since this is the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, when FDR moved Pacific Fleet from California to Hawaii in the spring of 1940 to deter Japanese aggression, it ultimately had the opposite effect. And by concentrating American forces within the range of the Imperial Japanese Navy, FDR presented the Japanese the opportunity to strike a decisive blow. So I think storing the keys to the global economy just 100 miles from the Chinese Communist Party presents a similarly attractive target. And with just one move, China could assume near total control of global semiconductor production and dictate the terms to which other nations can participate in the global economy. There's other things I could say about this, but I've gone on too long. I just want to emphasize, though, that our defense, though I'm talking about this primarily in terms of global economics, our defense of Taiwan, I think, is bound up in things much bigger than just the economic aspects of our relationship and our concern over semiconductors. I think we have a values-based interest in protecting a successful democracy, as well as a geopolitical or military interest in preserving our current force posture in the Indo-Pacific. So I don't want you to think I'm just sort of ruthlessly thinking about this purely through the lens of how we make money and build things in the United States.
That's a great point. Mark, you have done some really extensive work in the area of the threats that Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party has posed to the US semiconductor industry. What recommendations do you have that you think are most likely to succeed in countering these threats?
Thanks, Dmitri. First, I want to comment on something that Representative Gallagher said and double down that, I was one of our senior war planners for the Pacific for about 5 years. And, the easy solution is on something like this is to remove ourselves from dependency on Taiwan. But that actually undermines the economic and democratic developments that have happened there. So, I mean, we sometimes, when you're a democracy like we are, your planning is the harder. You have to take the harder approach, and the harder approach is figuring out how to continue to build a fruitful, comprehensive economic relationship with Taiwan that backs up the security guarantees we have, and that's going to be a more complex problem. But getting at how to get at China first, I believe we will get the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which includes both CHIPS and EFA done. It's easier for me to say that than Representatives Khanna and Gallagher, because I don't have to vote on it, but I think we're going to get there. I also think we're starting to understand how to not do ad hoc protection of our technology. What happened with AMSL? I mean, we almost lost on the last iteration of EUV, transfer technology. And so I think we're going to get into a more coherent effective controls on this technology, and do it with our allies and partners. Specific things that commission look like. We wrote a paper on ICT supply chain. We had 13 recommendations. A couple of them I think are going to come out in the NDAA. One having to do with critical technology security centers. The idea that DHS would competitively select, designate, and fund critical technology security centers for evaluating and testing the security of devices, so that the Chinese can't get into them as easily. The ones that underpin our networks and critical infrastructure. And I think I do know that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, actually gave $157 million to DHS's Science and Technology Directorate to look at exactly these types of issues. So I think we're going to get a win there. When you combine the appropriations with the authorities, you can really get stuff done. And then, I know it sounds obvious, but we put in some direction to please develop a strategy. These legislative branch asking the executive branch to do that. We did that last year, and this year we got the executive order on America's supply chains back in February. I think that set in motion a quadrennial supply chain review. So just this basic thing of, could you organize the executive branch into having one supply chain strategy instead of 13 supply chain strategies? I think we'll see some successes there. So some of those aren't as big as others, but I do think there's going to be some big successes over the past 6 months and over the 6 months going forward.
So I want to remind the audience, I know we have a lot of press on the call as well, that please submit your questions. We'll turn to them in a minute. Sarah, one last question for you before we do that. When it comes to export control, obviously not all of the IP, not all the companies are here in the United States. ASML has been mentioned as one of the critical ones, but there are many others in other parts of the world, in Europe and in Japan and South Korea. How do you think we can work with allies to make sure that we're shoring up export controls, not just domestically, but we're all doing it together? Because the last thing we want to do, of course, is have our own US companies be at a disadvantage because they can't sell to China, but the rest of the world continues to do so freely.
Well, I think it's a great question. And before I answer it, I do think that Congressman Gallagher has to stop. So I just want to take a second and thank you so much for your time before you have to drop off. Really appreciated your insightful comments on the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for your leadership, Congressman.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I have 5 more minutes, but I'll
Irish exit
at that point. So good to get that out of the way now.
Okay, great. So, I think that this is a great question, Dmitri, and it's one that U.S. policymakers and industry are struggling with. Obviously, a unilateral export control, which was something that the Trump administration, really utilized in a number of instances, can serve a purpose and is sometimes the way to go. It also has the, unfortunate consequence of tying the hands of U.S. companies if our allies aren't coming along too. So I do think that we have to make a concerted effort to work with our allies. It is easier said than done. It is very hard sometimes to bring our allies along, but I do think that, going back to my earlier point, if we are able to convene a group of like-minded countries that share the same objectives here, we're going to be in a much better position. We all need to care about this. The future of, chip supply is not just a United States issue. This is a global issue. And so we need to be working in lockstep with other countries, not just on export controls and on the specific measures that we're taking, but also on what does the export control regime look like? If we have one set of laws and regulations, but our allies don't have the same, we're not even going to be able to harmonize. So we've got to harmonize measures. We have to harmonize regimes. We need to be looking at investment reviews, inbound, potentially outbound, as Congressman Gallagher also mentioned. And I think that we need to be also thinking about other trade actions. China's industrial subsidies. What are we doing there? How are we working with partners there? Some of this will be public facing, some of it won't be. But I think that at the end of the day, our partners have seen, and we have seen through this global shortage, exactly where some of the vulnerabilities are and what we are facing if we don't take concerted action. And so that should be a warning signal that we need to start coordinating more.
Great. I want to add that I think this is a unique opportunity to have a frank discussion with industry about export controls, because if you add up all of the investments that are on the table right now, both the CHIPS Act, the $52 billion from US government, the investments that Europeans and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwanese are planning to put in, as well as industry investments as well. Intel and Micron alone have committed over $100 billion to invest. You're probably approaching close to $1 trillion in investments over the next decade. So it's an opportunity to tell the industry that you're going to get tremendous amounts of money from a variety of different sources that should compensate for the losses you might endure from the shut off of exports, some exports to China. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation with industry for sure. So let's go to audience questions. We had one, Congressman Khanna and Congressman Gallagher, for you. And that is about USICA and the inclusion of $52 billion for the CHIPS Act there. Should Congress be more prescriptive in how the funding is spent, including the addition of the guardrails, as you discussed? Is that something that is expected to be brought up when USICA goes to conference, or do you plan to leave that to Commerce and the administration?
I'll jump in. I do think we need more robust guardrails, as I mentioned before. I talked about double dipping. I'm glad the White House is pushing back on Intel's reported plans to build a new fab in, I forget where it is, Chengdu maybe. But it begs the question, why were they thinking about doing that in the first place? And I'd also be open to, and maybe this is outside the scope of this bill, but I do think we need a more robust system for outbound capital controls, as I mentioned before. I mean, you look at the Wall Street Journal reported last month, American investors have participated in 58 deals in the Chinese semiconductor industry over the last 3 years. That's double the figure from the prior 4 years. So with the current lack of outbound controls, U.S. policy is now in the contradictory position of providing federal funding for semiconductor innovation at home, while then freely allowing Americans to contribute to semiconductor innovation in China. I think that's self-defeating. I think it's dangerous. Whether you're an investment firm or a semiconductor company, you should not be allowed to invest in Chinese semiconductor development, full stop, with the threat rising every day, particularly of a confrontation over Taiwan. So I do hope we look at inserting some more robust guardrails. And I will also take this opportunity to apologize as I quietly Irish exit from this and leave all of the hard press questions to Raul Khanna, as I'm fond of doing. But the good news is he's much smarter than me, so he can handle it.
Oh, please. I don't have a PhD.
Thank you so much, Congressman Gallagher. Congressman Khanna, your thoughts on the guardrails issue and whether you think it might get into the existing bill or future bills?
I support strong guardrails. I mean, I don't think U.S. taxpayer investment should be going to something that's going to help strengthen China's competitiveness, or frankly, any other nation's competitiveness. That's U.S. taxpayer funded dollars that should be used for development of technology in advanced manufacturing in the United States. I'm confident we will get those guardrails in. Now, having served at Commerce, let me just say one other thing. It's important for Commerce to have a collaboration with the private sector and technical and scientific experts. It's not, there's some wonderful people at Commerce, but there's also a lot of bureaucracy that doesn't understand the changing economy. And we need to really have the leading experts, technologists in there in designing this. The last thing I would want is for Congress to be prescriptive about things, about where fabs and others should go, because that would be all half dictated by electoral politics. So we want to get it out of congressional decision-making, have a Congress set the appropriate guardrails, and then really have a collaboration with the administration, the private sector, technical experts on how we can maximize our competitive advantage.
Great. There's a question from what I assume is the medical industry, but the question is, vital technologies such as pacemakers, ventilators, infant warmers, and cancer therapy devices also rely on a variety of semiconductor chips, but only small, maybe only 1% of the market. Do you think there is a role for the government to publicly identify and encourage suppliers to prioritize critical sectors such as healthcare and medical technology impacted by the shortages? Maybe Congressman Khanna, and then Mark can address that.
Yes, I think one of the things we have to do post-pandemic is look at some of our vulnerabilities as a society. Where were things that we needed, that were critical, that we realized that we don't have the full manufacturing capacity. Mark Andreessen had a great op-ed a couple of years ago where he said, well, I understand we don't have advanced technology, but masks, we can't even make masks fully in this country. So I would look at areas as a nation where we're vulnerable. If there's, unfortunately, a future pandemic or a future threat, and make sure that we as a government are incentivizing that critical supply chain to be as much in the United States or with key allies as possible.
Great. Mark, any thoughts on that, on the medical device issue particularly?
I agree with Congressman Khanna. Then I would say, as we help you medical device providers, why don't you go ahead and start building cybersecurity into your devices? Because one of the things that really concerns me is that they're building these devices with almost no cybersecurity, and they can be exploited in a really drastic, morbid way. So I think there's a give and take on this, and I'm happy to see both happen.
Great. One more question, Sarah, for you. The current legislation focuses primarily on investments in cutting edge chips, the 10 nanometer and below nodes. But how do we balance the needs of critical sectors like medical technology and defense that rely on much more mature and legacy chips at 28 nanometer and above?
Well, I think it's absolutely right that we need to focus at least a sizable portion of U.S. efforts on, being a global leader, investing in R&D and innovation so that we can be, at the leading edge. But I think we have to also look at where our demand is going domestically and globally, and what types of chips we're going to need for those use cases. And so I think we have to do a mapping both domestically and globally so that we can understand, for the legacy chips, how many do we need? What do we produce here? What should we be producing here? What can we rely on our allies to produce when we're talking about these less advanced and more mature nodes? I think it's a critical question, and I think it doesn't get as much attention as looking at the leading edge.
Congressman Khanna and Mark Montgomery, there's a question that is closely related, which is on cybersecurity. A huge number of US semiconductor companies, both in the software space, design, as well as manufacturing, have been infiltrated by Chinese military and intelligence agencies over the last decade, and in a goal to steal their intellectual property. As we're focusing on providing a lot of money to this industry, what kind of cybersecurity requirements should we be thinking about to make sure that this new IP that they develop with taxpayer money does not go out the back door to China because of IP theft that they're engaging in?
That's a huge challenge. I'd be curious to get Mark's thoughts. I believe the president should announce a Manhattan Project on cybersecurity, where we really mobilize this country in preparing not just the government and our government agencies, but whole swaths of the private sector and critical infrastructure from the threats of a cyber attack. And we have extraordinary professionals at NSA and at the highest levels in our government. I am confident that our most sensitive technology is quite protected. Our bigger vulnerability is in the vast private sector and critical infrastructure, in getting them both to adopt best practices, such as simple things like having cybersecurity protections on, even if they may not be convenient, and then having the technical know-how to protect things. I would even be open to some form of liability if that you don't have a sufficient standard of cybersecurity. But I think that we have to have far more mobilization as a nation on this.
Mark,
I jump in there. I agree completely.
Solarium.
Yeah. I mean, you hit right on our favorite topics here. I believe strongly in that systemically important critical infrastructure idea. And I think some of these companies should qualify for it. This is the difference between what we see now and what we saw 6 years ago when we started Executive Order 13636 and the Section 9 of that. I really think some of these companies are in there. And when you think about the MSSPs that provide the software to the MSPs, I mean, those companies are just so key to our, to our supply chain, the software security of our supply chain. They have to be part of this. And I think the back end of that liability protection is that if you meet the standard of security that the government sets and you have third-party assessments, you'll get some limited liability protection. But you have to meet that and maintain that standard and demonstrate it, and not do anything completely egregious at the moment of malicious cyber activity. So I think there's some great opportunity here, Dmitri, and I really think we can't let these companies go. We can't let them get below the radar screen and miss them like we did the ISPs, the internet service providers, 6 years ago when we made Section 9.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Congressman Khanna, Congressman Gallagher, Montgomery, and of course, Sarah Stewart. This discussion has been very constructive in laying out what is at stake if the U.S. and its partners do not act swiftly and strategically to bolster the semiconductor manufacturing and supply chain resiliency and really mitigate the geopolitical risks from the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you again to our fantastic speakers for taking the time to share their views and recommendations. We hope this was useful to educate this audience and to spark some fresh thinking about how the U.S. can tackle the global semiconductor shortage and more strategic supply chain issues in the sector. So thank you for your leadership, Congressman Khanna, and your time this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. Great discussion.
Thank you.